Those words sliced through the atmosphere like shattered crystal. The crowded restaurant fell silent as everyone turned to look. An affluent pair seated at a corner table had just expressed disdain toward a young African-American server who had dared to approach the commotion erupting in Atlanta's most upscale establishment. This evening had transformed beyond a simple meal. It had become a matter of respect, compassion, and a tale that would remain etched in everyone's memory forever. The Magnolia Room was renowned for its pristine white linens, sparkling crystal fixtures, and clientele filled with business executives and famous personalities. However, on this particular evening, the most memorable incident wasn't related to prosperity or celebrity status. Everything began with the heart-wrenching cries of a young child. Ethan Whitmore, a 9-year-old boy with autism and son of billionaire executive Richard Whitmore, was experiencing an overwhelming episode. His wails bounced off the polished stone surfaces, piercing, unfiltered, and filled with desperation. His father's hands trembled as he attempted to soothe him, yet nothing seemed effective. With each passing moment, the murmurs intensified. "Isn't that Richard Whitmore's child?" someone whispered. "Wealth doesn't guarantee good parenting," another person remarked dismissively. Then came the most devastating comment of all. "Perhaps that African-American waitress should handle him. She's likely experienced with managing such difficult children." Every gaze shifted toward her. Aaliyah Carter, 24 years old, with a glowing complexion, confident stance, and immaculate uniform. She hadn't sought this situation, yet destiny had placed her directly in its center, a black woman positioned in a space filled with authority, bias, and wealth. The condemnation in their voices was palpable, yet her focus remained unwavering. This transcended just another evening of work. This represented a narrative about cruelty and compassion, affluence and hardship, humiliation and bravery, a narrative demonstrating that occasionally the most unexpected individual present possesses the courage to accomplish the extraordinary. So remain with me, because Aaliyah's next action hushed the entire establishment and might transform your perspective on the world. Understanding the key players, to comprehend why this moment held such significance, you must understand the person at its heart. Aaliyah Carter was far from just another server. At 24, she carried herself with the elegance of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she possessed. Raised in Atlanta's South Side by a single mother working double nursing shifts, Aaliyah understood intimately the harsh reality of adversity. She possessed intelligence, quick reflexes, and her rich brown eyes had a captivating quality, as though they could penetrate through pretense and see a person's true character. Life hadn't been kind. She knew the feeling of being ignored, dismissed, or reduced to nothing more than her skin color. Yet she refused to allow resentment to shape her identity. Instead, she had mastered the skill of commanding presence. When Aaliyah entered any space, she didn't retreat. She stood proudly, even in her server's uniform, which was always perfectly pressed and clean. Her smile conveyed quiet strength, a smile that communicated she wasn't there to judge, only to serve humanity. Across the dining area sat Richard Whitmore, the individual everyone in Atlanta knew by sight. At 52, he was the billionaire head of Whitmore Technologies, whose decisions could influence entire markets instantly. His clothing was custom-made in New York, his vehicles imported from Germany, and his reputation as an uncompromising business leader made him both respected and feared. Yet here, in this glamorous restaurant, none of that influence mattered. He wasn't an industrial giant. He was simply a parent, shaken and powerless as his autistic son's distress grew increasingly intense. And there was Ethan, 9 years old, delicate yet determined in his unique way. His autism made the environment louder, more intense, and more overwhelming than most could comprehend. The clatter of utensils, the buzz of conversations, the shimmer of overhead lights, they all collided until his body could no longer contain the turmoil. His screaming wasn't defiance. It was self-preservation. The Magnolia Room itself heightened the tension. This was Atlanta's dining scene's crown jewel, where million-dollar agreements were finalized over wine costing more than most people's monthly rent. Inside, the atmosphere carried scents of steak and truffle oil. The waitstaff moved like performers in a silent dance, and the unspoken expectation was clear. Only perfection was acceptable. That evening, perfection crumbled, and standing between the burden of wealth and the sting of prejudice was Aaliyah Carter, a young black woman about to demonstrate that bravery often appears in the most unlikely circumstances. The crisis unfolds. The initial cry had startled the room, but what followed shook it to its foundation. Ethan's voice climbed higher, cutting through the chandelier's glow with raw, desperate sound. He shoved his dish aside, the ceramic rattling against the surface, and grasped at the utensils with shaking fingers. The sharp crash of a fork striking the floor made nearby patrons flinch. When he knocked a knife down, the metallic ring sliced through the jazz melody like an alarm. Richard leaned closer, his hand shaking as he whispered his son's name, pleading, nearly begging, "Ethan, please, son, just take a breath." "I'm right here with you." But his words were overwhelmed by another cry, louder, sharper, reverberating off the polished marble flooring. Richard's complexion was ashen, his brow damp with perspiration. Despite all his billions, he appeared to be the most helpless person present. The responses came quickly. At one table, a woman wearing a diamond choker leaned toward her spouse and whispered, "This is shameful. He should remove that child from here." At another table, a man in costly attire released a brief laugh. "Can you imagine being a billionaire and unable to manage your own child?" But it wasn't amusement. It was cruelty. Their comments cut into Richard like blades. His jaw tightened, but he remained still, supporting his son's shoulders as Ethan rocked back and forth, hands clutching the chair's edge as if trying to anchor himself against a tempest only he could perceive. The sound developed into a pattern: cry, gasp, cry again. The waitstaff froze in position, uncertain whether to approach or pretend nothing was occurring. The manager stood by the bar, shifting uneasily, his eyes already searching for security. Then, from the room's far side, came a voice sharp enough to silence even the jazz ensemble. "Someone remove that child immediately. This establishment is for people who understand proper behavior." The words came from a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair, his tone dripping with entitlement. Heads nodded in agreement around him, as if he had voiced what many others were thinking. The weight of judgment pressed down on Richard until his shoulders drooped. He looked around, eyes moving from face to face, seeking even the smallest hint of empathy. There was none, only stares, whispers, and sneers. Then his eyes found Aaliyah. She stood several tables away, tray still in hand, her posture steady. While the rest of the room recoiled, her gaze remained calm, steady, and fearless. For the first time that evening, Richard felt someone saw him not as a billionaire, not as a spectacle, but as a father who was breaking the confrontation. Begins. Just when the tension couldn't escalate further, the whispers changed direction. No longer aimed solely at Richard and his son, they turned toward the young woman standing nearby. A man in a navy jacket leaned back in his seat, smirking as his voice carried far enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Perhaps the black waitress should handle him. Her kind are accustomed to dealing with children who can't control themselves." The words struck the room like a physical blow. Several guests chuckled quietly, attempting to hide their amusement behind wine glasses. Others shook their heads but remained silent, unwilling to challenge the cruelty. Silence, Aaliyah understood, could be as violent as the insult itself. Her grip tightened on the tray she held, the polished silver trembling momentarily before she steadied it. She had encountered comments like this before, on public transportation, in stores, sometimes even from educators during her own schooling. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the insult wasn't just directed at her. It concerned a child who was suffering, a father who was crumbling, and an entire room willing to transform their discomfort into hatred. Richard's face turned crimson. He began to stand, anger flickering in his eyes, but Aaliyah gave the slightest head shake. Her gaze told him, "Wait, don't." She wasn't frightened. Not anymore. From the bar, the restaurant manager cleared his throat sharply. His eyes locked on Aaliyah. "Stay out of it," he mouthed, his expression a warning. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. He wanted her to remain still, smile, and let the chaos pass. But Aaliyah couldn't. She saw the little boy trembling in his seat, his fists pressed against his ears as if the entire world was too overwhelming to bear. She saw Richard, his expensive suit now wrinkled, looking less like a CEO and more like a man on the verge of collapse. And she felt the heavy atmosphere of judgment filling the Magnolia Room, thick with entitlement and prejudice. She took a slow step forward. The sound of her shoes on the polished floor was soft, but in the quiet that followed Ethan's cries, it seemed loud enough to challenge the entire room. Her heart was racing, her palms moist, but her voice, when it finally emerged, was steady. Perhaps instead of ridiculing, we could attempt a little kindness. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Every head turned, every eye focused on her. For the first time that evening, the conversation wasn't about wealth or failure or appearances. It was about courage, and it had come from the person the room least expected to speak. The act of compassion, Aaliyah placed the tray on an empty table and walked toward Richard and his son. Every step felt heavier, as if the stares of the wealthy guests were weights attached to her ankles. She could hear the low murmurs following her, the disapproving sighs, the quiet scoffs, but she didn't stop. When she reached the table, she didn't tower over the boy as so many adults did. Instead, she lowered herself slowly, kneeling until her eyes were level with his. Ethan's face was red, streaked with tears. His small hands covered his ears as though he were trying to block out the world. His chest heaved with sharp, irregular breaths. Aaliyah maintained her distance initially, giving him space. Her voice was soft but clear, a calm contrast to the noise surrounding them. "Hello there," she said gently. "You're safe. I know it feels overwhelming right now, but I'm here with you." Richard's eyes widened. He looked torn between relief and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process that this young waitress had stepped into the storm he couldn't control. From across the room, someone scoffed. "This is absurd. She thinks a few kind words will solve it." A ripple of laughter followed, but Aaliyah ignored it. Her focus never wavered from Ethan. She reached slowly into her apron pocket and pulled out something small, a bracelet of wooden beads worn smooth with time. She had carried it for years, a simple token that helped her stay grounded during long nights and difficult days. Holding it out in her palm, she spoke again, her tone almost a whisper. "I have something for you. It's not much, but it helps me when things feel too loud. Would you like to try?" For a moment, Ethan didn't move. His cries softened, his breathing ragged but slower. His eyes darted to the bracelet, then back to her face. He didn't grab it right away, but he didn't push it away either. That hesitation, small as it was, felt like a miracle. Richard leaned closer, his voice breaking. He's noticing it. He never does this with strangers." The room held its breath. Aaliyah stayed perfectly still, her hand extended, her gaze steady and patient. She wasn't trying to force him. She was simply offering, waiting, and letting him know he wasn't alone. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But in that moment, the courage to kneel beside a child, to offer kindness in the face of cruelty, became the most powerful act in the entire restaurant. A fragile moment of peace. For one delicate moment, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's cries had softened, his eyes flickering between the bracelet in Aaliyah's hand and the glow of the chandelier above him. But then, as quickly as calm had arrived, the storm returned. His small body lurched forward, his hands slamming against the table with a force that made glasses rattle. The room erupted in gasps. A steak knife slid to the floor, clattering across the tiles. Ethan's voice rose again, sharp and frantic, filling every corner of the Magnolia Room. A couple at the nearest table pushed their chairs back. Glaring as if the boy had committed a crime instead of having a breakdown he couldn't control. Richard's shoulders sagged. He buried his face in his hands for a moment before lifting them to steady his son's trembling arms. His voice was broken. I can't reach him." "Nothing works anymore," the manager at the bar finally snapped. He whispered something to a security guard who started moving toward the table. The sight sent a wave of dread through Richard's chest. If they forced Ethan out, it wouldn't just be humiliating, it would devastate him. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She glanced up at the guard, then back at Ethan, her voice cut through the chaos. Firm but kind. "Give me one more opportunity." Ignoring the stares, she leaned a little closer to Ethan, keeping her tone calm, steady, and patient. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a small napkin she had folded earlier into the shape of a crude paper crane. It wasn't perfect, but it was simple, colorful, and soft. She placed it on the edge of the table just within Ethan's reach. "Sometimes," she whispered, "when the world feels too big, it helps to focus on something small. This little bird helped me once. Maybe it can help you." Ethan's cries wavered, caught between another scream and silence. His wide eyes landed on the paper crane. His breathing slowed just a fraction, enough for Richard to notice, enough for hope to flicker. But before anyone could exhale in relief, a man across the room muttered loudly, "This is pathetic. If the father can't control his son, why let some black waitress play hero?" Laughter followed, cruel and dismissive. Richard's jaw clenched. Aaliyah didn't move. She stayed on the floor, steady as stone, her eyes locked on Ethan, as though the entire world outside that child no longer mattered. The tension had reached its breaking point. Something had to give, either the boy, the father, or the woman who refused to back down. The breakthrough. The laughter faded into the background. Swallowed by a silence so sharp it seemed the entire restaurant leaned in to watch. Ethan's cries slowed, his body still rocking, but the sound no longer filled the air like shattered glass. His eyes stayed fixed on the paper crane, its fragile folds glowing under the chandelier's light. Aaliyah didn't rush him. She kept her hand on the table, palm open, her posture calm and steady. The storm inside Ethan was still there, but now there was something competing with it. Curiosity. His small fingers twitched, then hovered over the napkin bird. The first touch was hesitant. He brushed it lightly, almost pulling back as though afraid it might vanish. Then slowly, he picked it up with trembling hands. The paper crinkled softly, and he turned it over again and again, as if studying the strange little thing that had somehow interrupted his chaos. The sound of his sobs dissolved into short, uneven breaths. The restaurant, which just moments ago had been filled with judgment and whispers, now fell into stunned quiet. Forks were frozen mid-air, glasses untouched. No one dared speak. All eyes were locked on the boy who, for the first time that evening, was silent. Richard pressed a hand to his mouth, tears filling his eyes. His voice was barely audible. I've never seen him calm this quickly." "Not like this." Aaliyah glanced up at him, her gaze steady but soft. "Sometimes it just takes the right thing, something that speaks to him." Ethan shifted in his chair, his breathing finally evening out. He placed the crane gently on the table, then reached toward Aaliyah's bracelet, still resting in her open hand. With small, deliberate movements, he slipped it over his wrist. The wooden beads clicked softly against each other as he rolled them between his fingers. His body, once rigid with tension, began to relax. It wasn't perfect calm. His eyes still darted around the room, his shoulders still tight, but the screams were gone. The storm had broken. Across the room, someone whispered, "How? How did she do that?" Another voice, hushed and almost reverent, replied, "I don't know, but she did." For Richard, none of that mattered. He leaned close to his son, his hands trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from Ethan's damp forehead. Then he looked at Aaliyah, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't even have the words." And for the first time that night, the billionaire who had everything was humbled by the quiet strength of a woman who had nothing but courage. The cruel interruption for a brief, fragile moment, peace seemed to settle over the Magnolia Room. Ethan's small hands moved carefully along the beads of Aaliyah's bracelet. His breathing steady, his eyes no longer frantic. Richard exhaled for what felt like the first time all night, his shoulders sagging with relief. Around them, silence lingered, heavy but calm. But peace never lasted long in a room filled with judgment. From the corner table, the man in the navy blazer who had mocked earlier leaned forward again. His voice, sharp with arrogance, sliced through the quiet. Well, I'll be damned. Looks like the black girl does know how to keep him quiet. Maybe she missed her calling as a nanny instead of pretending to belong in a place like this. The words hung in the air, heavier than any scream. A few chuckles bubbled up, nervous but real. The kind that came from people who would never say the words themselves, but were all too eager to laugh at someone else's cruelty. Richard froze, his relief turning instantly into fury. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out. He turned to the man, ready to unleash a storm of his own, but Aaliyah caught his eye. Her look was steady, unshaken. She shook her head slightly. Not now, but inside the insult burned. She had heard variations of it her whole life, in classrooms, on sidewalks, even whispered behind her back at jobs where she worked twice as hard to be seen as equal. Tonight, though, the cruelty was louder, public, and shameless. She rose from her crouch, still calm, still graceful, and straightened to her full height. Though she wore the uniform of a waitress, her posture carried the weight of someone who refused to be diminished. "Respect is free," she said, her voice low but steady, directed at the man, though the whole room heard. "If it costs you nothing, why do you spend so much energy withholding it?" The man smirked, raising his glass as if to brush her off. But Richard leaned across the table, his voice tight and cold. "You should be ashamed. That woman just did what none of us, including me, could do. She deserves respect, not ridicule." The restaurant stirred. A few diners nodded subtly, their expressions shifting from discomfort to recognition. Others still looked uneasy, unwilling to confront the prejudice in front of them. But Aaliyah didn't wait for their approval. She turned back to Ethan, her face softening again. Because for her, the only opinion that mattered was the child who had found a moment of calm in her presence, and in that choice to ignore cruelty and return to compassion, her strength spoke louder than any insult ever could. Another crisis emerges. Just when it seemed the storm had finally passed, the calm began to fracture again. Ethan's grip on the bracelet tightened, his small fingers rolling the beads faster and faster. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his eyes darting around the dining room as if the walls were closing in. Richard noticed it first. The flicker of panic returned to his son's face, that unmistakable signal that another meltdown was coming. His voice cracked as he whispered, "No, not again. Please, not again." Aaliyah saw it too. The rhythm of his breathing, the trembling in his arms, the way his body stiffened, it was all too familiar. She had witnessed children spiral like this before, in grocery stores, on buses, in schools. A single sound, a single flicker of light could pull them back into the storm without warning. And then it happened. Ethan let out a sharp cry, louder than before, the sound ripping through the uneasy calm like lightning across a dark sky. He shoved the bracelet off his wrist, the wooden beads scattering across the floor. Gasps filled the room as a glass toppled from their table and shattered. The guard at the bar started moving again. And this time, the manager didn't stop him. Richard's voice broke. Desperate now. "I can't do this anymore. I don't know how to help him." His hands shook as he tried to hold Ethan still, but the boy's body thrashed, lost in a world only he could feel. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she didn't back away. She scanned the restaurant, her eyes searching for something, anything, that might break through the chaos again. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, tucked into a corner, stood a massive glass aquarium. Its soft blue light shimmered against the wall, casting slow, calming waves across the marble floor. Inside, schools of bright fish moved in hypnotic patterns, darting and circling in graceful silence. Aaliyah's eyes lit with sudden clarity. She leaned toward Richard, her voice urgent but calm. "The aquarium. Look at it. Maybe he'll focus on that. Trust me." Richard hesitated, torn between doubt and hope. But Ethan's cries rose again, his fists pounding the table, and Richard knew he had nothing left to lose. Aaliyah extended her hand toward Ethan, not to touch, just to guide. "Hey, sweetheart. Want to see the fish with me? They're really beautiful. Come on." For a brief second, Ethan paused, his cries faltering as his eyes flickered toward the glow at the edge of the room. It wasn't silence, not yet, but it was a start, and in that fragile hesitation, a new chance for peace was born. The aquarium solution, Richard rose from his chair, his hand trembling as he reached for his son's. Ethan resisted at first, his body rigid, but his gaze kept darting toward the soft glow at the far end of the dining room. The aquarium shimmered in shades of blue and green, its bubbles rising in steady streams, its fish weaving silently through the water. "Come on, buddy," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "Let's just take a little walk. Just a little walk." Aaliyah moved beside them, her presence steady, her tone gentle and reassuring. "We don't have to stay at the table, Ethan. Let's go see the fish. Just you, me, and your dad." "What do you think?" The boy's cries slowed, caught between another outburst and the pull of curiosity. His hands shook, but after a moment he let Richard guide him from the chair. Step by step, they crossed the room, the noise of shifting chairs and murmured voices following behind them. The guard paused, uncertain, while the manager crossed his arms, clearly impatient but unwilling to interrupt. When they reached the glass, the change was almost instant. Ethan froze, eyes wide, as he stared at the flickering colors moving in the tank. His breath came in shorter bursts, then steadied, his small palms pressing against the cool surface. A bright yellow fish darted past, followed by a cluster of blue ones that swam in perfect unison. For the first time that night, his body relaxed, his shoulders softened, his fists unclenched, and the cries that had filled the restaurant only moments ago were replaced by quiet wonder. He leaned forward, tracking the fish with his eyes, his lips parting as though he might speak. Though no words came, Richard stood behind him, one hand resting on his son's shoulder, his face overwhelmed with relief. Tears streamed freely now, unchecked, his chest heaving with the release of all the fear and helplessness that had weighed on him. He looked at Aaliyah, his voice breaking into a whisper. You did this. You gave him peace. I don't know how, but you did." Aaliyah shook her head softly, her eyes on Ethan. "It wasn't me. It was him. He just needed something to focus on. Sometimes the smallest shift can change everything." Behind them, the restaurant was still hushed, as if the entire room had been caught watching something sacred. The cruelty, the laughter, the whispers, all of it faded into silence in the face of a little boy who had finally found calm in the glow of an aquarium. Richard scanned the Magnolia Room, once filled with whispers and judgment, now stood in stunned silence. Every eye was fixed on the boy at the aquarium, his hands pressed against the glass, his breathing calm for the first time that evening. The sight of Ethan, peaceful, almost mesmerized by the glowing fish, felt like a miracle no one had expected to witness. Richard stood close behind his son, his hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder, but his gaze swept across the dining room. No longer timid or ashamed, he looked at the faces that had ridiculed him. Earlier, the same people who had laughed at his struggle, and his voice carried a quiet authority that silenced even the faintest. "Murmur, you all witnessed it," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "You mocked my son. You mocked me. And when you couldn't understand what was happening, you turned on her." He gestured toward Aaliyah, who stood a few steps away, her posture steady but humble. "That woman accomplished what none of you could do. She gave my boy something you couldn't: patience, compassion, humanity." A ripple of unease spread through the room. A few guests shifted in their seats, eyes downcast, ashamed to meet his gaze. Others looked uncomfortable, faces stiff, unwilling to admit their cruelty. The man in the navy blazer scoffed, muttering under his breath, "She just got lucky." But Richard's eyes locked on him, and the sharpness in his stare was enough to cut the words short. "Luck." Richard's voice deepened, heavy with emotion. Luck didn't kneel down in front of a child in pain. Luck didn't offer kindness when all of you offered scorn. Luck didn't stand tall when you tried to belittle her for the color of her skin. That was not luck. That was courage. The room was still. Then, from one table near the back, came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. A woman in a dark green dress, her eyes wet with tears, began to applaud. Others followed, first hesitant, then louder, until the sound filled the restaurant. Aaliyah's chest tightened. She hadn't come for applause. She hadn't stepped forward to be recognized. But in that moment, the weight of every insult, every smirk, every whisper was lifted by the sound of hands coming together. Not for the food, not for the wealth, but for a simple act of compassion. Richard turned back to her, his expression softening. His voice cracked as he spoke. "You saved us tonight. Not just my son. You saved me, and in that moment, surrounded by wealth, power, and privilege. The richest man in the room was not the CEO. It was the young black woman who had chosen humanity over silence. The lasting impact. The applause slowly faded, but the impact lingered like a ripple spreading across still water. Ethan remained at the aquarium, his small hands moving along the glass as he followed the fish with wide, steady eyes. Richard stood behind him, calmer now, his breath no longer shaky, his shoulders finally relaxed. The storm had passed, at least for tonight. Aaliyah took a step back, letting father and son have their moment. She had no desire to stand in the spotlight. She wasn't searching for praise, and she wasn't trying to prove anything. To her, kindness had never been about performance. It was about presence, about showing up when no one else would. Richard turned toward her, his voice low but thick with emotion. "I've spent my life chasing power, chasing wealth, chasing the next deal. But tonight, you reminded me of what really matters. You reminded me that sometimes the smallest act of humanity means more than all the money in the world." Aaliyah gave a gentle smile, her eyes soft. "We all need someone who will stand by us in our hardest moments. Your son isn't broken. He just needs understanding. That's not weakness. That's love." The words seemed to lift something heavy from Richard's chest. He nodded, swallowing hard, his hand tightening protectively on Ethan's shoulder. As the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, the guests were no longer whispering or judging. They looked different now, some ashamed, some thoughtful, and some deeply moved. Aaliyah hadn't just calmed a child. She had shifted the energy of an entire room. Later that night, as the Whitmores prepared to leave, Richard paused at the door. He looked back at Aaliyah, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You gave us hope tonight, and I won't forget it." She didn't answer with words, only a nod, but her smile said enough. The lesson was clear. Compassion costs nothing, but it can change everything. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it kneels beside a frightened child. And respect should never depend on race, status, or wealth. It should simply be given because every human being deserves it. So the next time you see someone struggling, ask yourself, will you turn away, or will you step forward even when it feels uncomfortable? Because you never know. Your smallest act of kindness might be the miracle someone else has been waiting for. If this story touched your heart, don't just walk away. Share it. Talk about it. And let it remind you of what we're all capable of. And if you want to hear more stories that prove humanity still matters, make sure to subscribe and stay with us, because sometimes one story really can change the way we see the world.